Hi, folks. Denise Howell here. And next up on Triangulation, Alex Howard joins me today. He is the former deputy director of the Sunlight Foundation and one of the authors of the Honest Ads Act. He's a longtime writer, advocate, blogger, and analyst on open government and transparency issues. And today we're going to discuss the Honest Ads Act and otherwise addressing election meddling. We'll talk about the content moderation dilemma, and lastly, the $5 billion fine against Facebook, which seems to be the best the FTC could do with the tools at its disposal. All this and more next on Triangulation.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Triangulation, episode 407, recorded July 26th, 2019. Alex Howard. This episode of Triangulation is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. Hiring is challenging, but there's one place you can go where hiring is simple and smart. That place is ZipRecruiter, where growing businesses connect to qualified candidates. Try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/triangulation. Hi, folks. I'm Denise Howell, and you're joining us for Triangulation. We're here today with Alex Howard, who is a longtime blogger, independent writer, digital governance expert, and open government advocate. Alex and I were just saying before the show, we've seen each other knocking around online for years, so it's wonderful to finally make your acquaintance, Alex.
You too. It's such a pleasure to join you.
Much to discuss today. You've had a really interesting career, and you're working on issues near and dear to the hearts of, I'm sure, many of our listeners, and if not all of them. So let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about your background, so people know how you got to where you are today. Tell me about your education.
I went to Colby College back in the 90s. Studied biology, sociology. I was a pre-med major, if you can do such a thing, and decided I really didn't care for organic chemistry and switched back to biology and sociology together, and graduated and wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I knew that it wasn't the thing I was thinking of, and ended up joining the internet industry. Moved to Boston in 1999 to join a e-business consulting firm called Sapient, and then stuck around there for a decade doing all kinds of different things before I became a tech writer full-time. What first got you interested in technology? I was a science fiction fan. I was reading Jules Verne, Isaac Asimov as a little boy. I was lucky enough to have an Apple II Plus in the 80s. I was playing wizardry, logged on to the internet for the first time in a bulletin board service in 93, and instantly was enraptured by the potential of connecting to people around the world, to ideas, to sharing what was happening, and to the connection there. I've added eventually some more understanding and built from there. I continue to be bullish upon the potential of humans to reach something greater when we can access information and share it, despite all that we've seen in the past, decade, about some of the downsides of that.
Yeah, the past decade has been hard, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. I've been here in DC the whole time and seen the boom and the bust and the backlash, and now the messiness of trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, it seems like all of the technologies that we thought would change the world for the better have had their shot at doing that and have made huge strides in that regard. But sometimes, particularly lately, we lose sight of some of that because of the negatives that have come up and made themselves apparent as well. What's the thing that you're most leery of that you've seen present itself in the last 10 years?
Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of things. I think the post-truth moment we're in is really difficult. The lack of central understanding about what's happening to the world and the impact of that upon our ability to really move and collective action to address any of those grand challenges is really hard to see. I've been pretty well acquainted with some of the worst parts of human nature long before we saw them on our computer screens. And in some ways, it's predictable that the worst angels, right, the devils of our nature would express themselves, that we would see the mirror of social media, the mirror of the web, of the internet, of the associated technologies reflect that back upon us. Right now, I think, though, that the challenges around misinformation, disinformation, something I've been focused on for a long time this last couple of years, is the other side of trustworthy information. And unless we can figure out how to bring people back to essential understanding of what's happening, it's going to be very difficult to create the collective will to then affect the kinds of changes we need to see to various aspects of society that I think are necessary to be responsive, right? And there are a lot of significant problems that you know very well, your listeners, your audience, the broader world is well acquainted with around privacy, around security, around identity, the three kind of pillars of the tech policy world. With climate change, the overarching existential issue, corruption, which I pay a fair bit of attention to. But the thing that is deeply troubling to me right now is because of, I think, maybe the political moment, because I've been in D.C., because I focused so much upon the broader space of open government for so many years now. That's difficult to see. And if we're unable to find a way to make progress on that across all the different stakeholders involved, from government, legislators, regulators, different officials, judges, to the media, and it's very heterogeneous. There's no the media, right? There's all these different stakeholders, to the technology companies, to the different parts of civil society, from libraries to schools to universities, to ourselves as information creators and consumers and distributors. I think we're going to have worse problems because I don't think the challenges are going to get less, right? And the wicked issues that have been there long before we have been this hyper-connected are persistent. And what gives me hope is that there are so many diverse approaches to this around the world, and that we'll see, I think, some better ways that, because of the ubiquity of communication, perhaps we can adapt and adopt across borders, across states, et cetera. But we'll see. There's going to be more black swan events within our lifetimes after the big bump a couple years ago.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I kind of sidetracked us from talking about your background, but you've been talking about it obliquely for the last minute or two as you described your passion for making sure that the public has complete and accurate information about important areas. So you started out in the late 90s, getting involved in the internet industry. Where'd you go from there?
I think I was kind of a classic member of my generation at sort of XY, right on the cusp, seeing the millennials sort of start to come into college, seeing Generation X, my older siblings, on the other side. And as a result, I think I'm classic. I had a bunch of different jobs. I worked as a cook, worked as a carpenter, worked as a teacher. I had a bunch of different kind of consulting or contract work in my 20s. So all these different things. It wasn't until sort of the very end that I came to full-time writing at a place called whatis.com, one of the oldest IT information sites on the internet. It was founded in the mid-90s, where an engineer named Lowell Thing at IBM got tired of answering the same questions and basically put them together into an IT encyclopedia, put it on the internet. And then a company called TechTarget acquired it. And I happened to find an interesting job listing, of all places, on Craigslist, and managed to get an associate editorship there, and quickly got drawn into the tech industry, but from the enterprise IT perspective, which is a bit different than the consumer world. But quickly my interest and my job, which was to try to see what was happening online that could be relevant to all the editors around me and to the audiences we had, which were IT professionals, what would make sense for engaging them. And of course, back in 2006, that was blogging. That was the crest of the Web 2.0 spaces. The web became more interactive. That was podcasting, something which has kind of boomed and then busted and now still very much around, including this show. I was there for a number of years. And what happened is that I moved from being sort of jack of all IT trades and as an editor to focusing more on the enjoyable world of regulatory compliance, right? Which is all the things that the laws and regulations require people in the IT world to do, but you're very well acquainted with, and started up a new site focused upon compliance where my audience, my community became privacy officers, security officers, CIOs, CISOs, all those people. And that brought me to DC in 2009 as a tech policy reporter, and I've stuck around for the past decade.
Right, and just a few years after that, you got involved with the Sunlight Foundation, and ultimately became its executive director.
Well, in between, there were a couple stops. One was at O'Reilly Media, which was a real career maker. 2010, Tim O'Reilly hired me to be their first Washington correspondent. And I went from just covering the smaller world of what you had to do to the much broader world of what would be possible with all these different technologies, collective intelligence, the use of the web for crowdsourcing, data and data analytics, opening data and the potential for that, open source technologies. I mean, O'Reilly Media is a big media company that focuses upon all these different emerging tech areas. And I got to cover all of that for 3 years, to be involved in it, by the end of that time, to be traveling around the world, connecting to people doing that work. And it opened a lot of doors for me, from industry, from government to media, you name it. After that, I was a fellow at the Tao Center at Columbia Journalism School, focusing on data journalism. It's one of my few published academic pieces. And then at the Kennedy School, the Ash Center for Government Innovation, there, where I focused upon the potential for networked transparency. So what happens when you get lots of people together talking about a given area? What kind of potential does that have to improve outcomes, from healthcare to the environment to housing, you name it? Stopped off at the Huffington Post for a year as a senior editor for technology and society. And then I ended up at Sunlight. And I was a senior analyst there. And then I got promoted to be the deputy director. So I was number 2. So
very cool.
Brings us back. Yeah.
Let me just shine a little light, if we can, on one of the things that you mentioned, your fellowship, where you wrote an academic paper on data journalism. Is that anything more complicated than journalism about data, or is there more to unpack there?
I think that's actually really a basic idea, right? It's reporting upon data as a source instead of humans. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. For many decades, journalists were, I think, pursuing this under the rubric of computer-assisted reporting, right? So there's a National Institute for Computer-Assisted Reporting at the University of Missouri. That's NICAR. That's associated with investigative reporters and editors, IRE. And there have been a lot of efforts over the decades to get computers integrated into newsrooms and then get journalists to be using them for the process of reporting. And specifically in that context, applying the social sciences, statistics, and the different methodologies involved to interrogating data as a source. And it was only in the last really decade or so that the idea of data journalism has popped up. And contrary to what some people might have thought, it existed long before Nate Silver adopted the term for his own purposes, which is basically adopting the statistical modeling and crunching that you get from the sports world, familiar to people who are trying to understand different teams, different players and their impact, et cetera, to other fields, from politics to environment to anything else where you can get data and then try to understand it. And it's kind of obvious at this point, but the impact of the internet and open source frameworks, open data, massive computing power that could be leveraged outside of a given place, all the different new frameworks for presenting, analyzing, visualizing, cleaning data have radically transformed what's possible. And the impact of that is something you can see online every day. In the investigative work from organizations like ProPublica to the in-house organs of the digital units at the various networks, to local news, to the transnational reporting of various bodies that try to dig into huge data dumps like the Panama Papers, et cetera. This is the tip of the spear in terms of using technology to inform the public, using a combination of public and private data, open source and proprietary technologies to try to leverage the immense changes in technology to improve the practice of journalism and bring us closer to the people who it's supposed to support, and ideally do the work with them in a way that enhances their trust and understanding of the reporting and, in theory, improves the reporting itself.
Right. So it sounds like it also focuses on not just knowing what sources of data are available and how to use them, but then how to know what to do and how to understand that data as a journalist, and how to make sure that you're, just as you would want to vet your sources if your sources were humans, if it is a data pool, you need to make sure that that information is reliable one way or another.
Yes, that's correct. And ideally, working with subject matter experts to ground truth that data too, whether they're government or industry or academics, whether they're some other person within the technical field has created that data, other people who can help you understand the provenance of it, any implicit biases or weaknesses in the data, to understand that data itself is not absolute, right? That there are things that it might not tell you. And how to be skeptical in that context, because right now I think it's fair to say that the idea of a computer-assisted reporter is somewhat passé, right? If you're in journalism at this point, you're using a computer, probably several computers, whether it's your phone, your laptop, desktop, computers that are remote in the cloud, So the question now is, what are you using them for, and with what expertise? And there's still, I think, a tremendous demand for people to do more than simply broadcast to the public, but to use these tools to inform, to connect, analyze. And there's some really exciting work that's being done from the papers of record, taking it to the next step and adopting computational journalism and interrogating the algorithms that increasingly make decisions for corporations or governments, to understanding and backward engineering the way that some of the corporations and governments are working and making decisions. And in some ways, I think there's no more important work in the public interest given the increase in impact that technology has on every aspect of society.
Right. And the increasing number of jobs that are being done by machine learning. As you said, you have to get into you called it interrogating the algorithm. I like that. To unearth its biases and how exactly it's getting to the information that it's offering you. Great stuff. So I totally understand now why you were the perfect fit to go work for several years at the Sunlight Foundation. We've mentioned that organization several times now. Why don't you explain to folks who are not familiar with it what it is, how it came to be, and what it aimed to achieve?
Sure. So Sunlight was founded over a decade ago by a woman, Ellen Miller, who'd come out of the public interest advocacy space, particularly around campaign finance. She worked for the Center for Responsive Politics, where she was a director. They run one of the best sites in that space, really anywhere in the world. They're cited in the Citizens United decision, opensecrets.org, where they would expose data about power, about lobbying, about campaign finance, who's donating, et cetera, money in politics. And Sunlight, when it was founded, tried to meld together a bunch of different things: journalism, policy and advocacy, communications, and most importantly, software development. So its differentiator was that they brought in developers to show government how to do it better, to get data from government, and then to mash it up, to make it into applications, to make it into web services, to open it sometimes, right, to structure it and make it available to the public and show government itself how to do that better. And then combine the reporting on top of that data journalism, with effective advocacy to try to get changes in the law, in rules and regulations to make politics and government more transparent to the people that they serve. And this goes back to an idea that that comes out of the Enlightenment, that if you're going to have a democracy, people need to be informed. And one of the things that they should have access to is the raw materials of our democracy, whether that's laws, whether that's rules, whether that's regulations, or all the different data that is created in the context of the business of government, the performance data, the administrative data, the outputs from the regulatory agencies or the scientific agencies. And those often are the best at this. Like NASA is great at that because part of their job is promulgating information they create on behalf of the public to the public. So supporting initiatives like data.gov, right, which had just got off the ground in 2009 when the Obama administration swept in. And Sunlight was a big part of trying to get government to use the internet better, to change the rules so that people in Congress and government officials could tweet. Now, these days, people might feel differently about that. They might say, tweet less or tweet better, But back then, the rules actually were pretty old, right? I mean, you've seen this arc. And so getting government to use the internet in positive ways was the second step. The first one is getting them to use the internet at all. And Sunlight was at the tip of the spear, pushing for that change and using a combination of lobbying and advocates and activism and beautiful communication, of really offering deep insight into design, into pushing for government to use open source technologies, to move away from proprietary technologies that trapped agencies into contracts where they had to use certain kinds of data, certain kinds of software, which often meant that those things were locked up and the public couldn't see, or the government ended up spending the huge amounts of money to get something that wasn't very good, something which, by the way, is still a pretty big problem at every level of government. And had some success, right? There are a bunch of different laws that have gotten passed. Some I was involved with, some predated me, that have changed the fundamental position, the default of government with respect to how it discloses information, how it structures information, how it uses information, that have really, I think, gone under the radar because it's often not very sexy and because people are pretty upset, justifiably, with how their different levels of government are performing. But there has been a sea change, and Sunlight was a big part of bringing that thinking into government.
Good. Let's talk about some of those specific positive changes that happened on your watch or started before your watch. We could all use some good news that things have changed for the better.
Sure. Well, where do you want to start?
Let's talk about how governments approach what information they make available.
Okay. So for a long time, governments, I think, have gotten used to the idea that they should publish statements, right? And every successful government public engagement campaign has used the media and mediums, right, of the time, whether you're looking back at the print world and pamphleteers, gazettes, or newspapers, to then radio, on into the world of television, cable television, and then the internet. And the World Wide Web and websites is a start. Then you move into the space of apps. And now it's, of course, about data, vast amounts of data. And people shouldn't mix these things up, right? You know very well, you start with raw data, structured data, information, and then in theory, you get to knowledge and then wisdom. Those are the hardest parts, of course. But you start with getting that fundamental data unlocked, and government at every level has data about what it does. But for many different governments, particularly around the world, but in many like state and local levels, is trapped in paper, trapped in PDFs, trapped in scans, trapped in systems that couldn't get out. And over the last 10 years, we've seen successive changes at every level of government where people understand that a website isn't just a static brochure, but something which you can use to engage the public, connect them with information and services that are relevant to them, that social media is a conversation, and that when you put the two together, you can change the default for government beyond you ask me for information and then maybe I give it to you in a couple of years under public records law, to I publish the information that you need to make crucial decisions whenever and wherever you're making them. Now, that's still a pretty vaunted goal, right? We're not there yet, particularly at the global level, international level, but we're so much further along in that direction than we were a decade ago. There are so many more cities and states that have open data websites. There's so many more cities and states which have 3-in-1 systems and listen to the public putting the information in. There's so many more that listen. And now there's increasingly starting to be different places that are engaging the people around that data to understand how they're using it and making sure that it's useful to them, and a couple that are starting to then use that information that they're getting from the public to improve the way they're doing disclosure, to improve the way that they're using and applying that data with the people that they serve. And I think that we'll see more of that over time because it's become part of the default for good governance around the world. Now, the downside, of course, is there's a lot of bad governance around the world. You know very well there's populist movements. There are liberal governments. And there they can and do suppress information which is embarrassing or shows fraud or criminality or waste or abuse, you name it, right? And their secrecy is used to hide corruption. It's used to hide information from the people that the governments are supposed to serve, right? And that's not something that we should expect to go away. But it is something which is significantly ameliorated by changes to laws, changes to policy, to regulations, to leadership, which understands that the worm has turned, that working in a networked environment is very different than the one that they're in before. And it's one in which information can spread like quicksilver through a given population and lead to changes, right? You can't look at what just happened in Puerto Rico, where you have a leak to investigative journalism outfit that shows behavior that the public is not comfortable with from the governor and from ministers, that then led to collective action and the threat of impeachment and then a resignation. There's going to be a new governor there coming in on the 2nd. So there is still that possibility, and that is catalyzed, embodied, accelerated by the penetration of technology, by this age of transparency, which is very uncomfortable, right, for many different people, many different institutions, because it's not, you can't easily get your hands around it, your head around it. You're faced with the uncomfortable decision if you're a dictator or an autocratic state to either turn off the internet or try to filter it, or try to create vast amounts of doubt in what's on it. And we see different regimes do different approaches to that, right? From China to Iran to Russia, North Korea, what's happening in Venezuela. It's a tremendously heterogeneous world. And of course, what's happening here in the United States, because we are hardly exempt from the challenges in this space. But there has been a sea change towards the default being openness and being more transparent about information that can be disclosed to the public without harm to privacy or security. And there's lots of categories of data under which that registers with the public as being relevant and not damaging. The hoariest examples are always weather data, getting the forecasts, or GPS, knowing where you are. But there's all kinds of other categories of information that enable you to make decisions, from health data around the quality of dialysis centers or nursing homes to transit data, where and how you can get around, to all kinds of relevant information around power and how it's being used and influenced. And I think we'll continue to see more of that. But to go back to the earlier part of the conversation, the challenge is going to be to create something like information fortresses or islands online where people can trust the information that's there and have third parties validate it in order to give them confidence that they can make decisions based upon that data, and not have various institutions successfully cast enough doubt upon the integrity of it that causes people to not trust it, not trust the institution, and to stop participating or leveraging it and to turn elsewhere, which is something that we, I think run a real risk of and see extant in many different places.
How do you feel like we're progressing to having that kind of intermediary level? As more and more data becomes available, that's wonderful. There's more and more data to crunch and good decisions that can be made from it, but it gets harder to manage as well.
It's spotty.
Mm-hmm.
The nation just saw testimony from the former special counsel. Special counsel's report has been out for months. If you read it, and I did, gone back to it, you see a whole bunch of things that are pretty clear, right? That there was systemic sweeping Russian interference in the election, that the Trump campaign accepted it, beckoned it, used it in various ways, and that then the president sought to obstruct the investigation in a multiple ways. And that those are three facts, right? But they're contested facts. There's evidence behind them. There's a institution with integrity and people who have trust associated with them who delivered those facts, and yet there's still no collective action upon doing something with them, in contrast to, say, Puerto Rico. And there are, I think, other examples too. We could talk about climate change, right? There are a whole set of facts which make it very clear that human activity is having an impact upon the planet and changes to it. The scientific evidence bears that out. There's a lot of different institutions which have validated that, and yet there's been successful doubt introduced enough into whether there's controversy around that then we have a challenge. The tip of the spear, unfortunately, in the online disinformation world, is often anti-vaccination campaigns. We know a lot about one of the greatest public health successes in history in eradicating things like smallpox, right? And yet, there's been enough doubt cast upon the potential harmful effects of vaccines that you have people who are choosing, who are highly educated people in many cases, not to vaccinate, which then has an impact upon herd immunity, et cetera. And what this shows us is that it's not enough just to have validated information from trustworthy institutions, even with the challenges that do exist within the academy, within the research, et cetera. It's not enough to have that be disseminated to the public. There needs to be more layers that give people reason to trust, and from the people around them to cause them to maybe look past some of their own confirmation biases. And that's going to be a really hard nut to crack in a world where we can increasingly choose what media we consume and when, including, of course, Twit.
Yes, thank you so much for the plug. That's a good segue to something that you've worked on recently that unfortunately did not take flight in the way that many had hoped it would, and that is the Honest Ads Act. Tell us about your involvement there.
Sure. So I was at Sunlight throughout 2016 and the election. Sunlight is a 501c3 nonprofit, which means that we can't evaluate campaigns on our issues. Now, as people might imagine, I definitely could offer analysis of Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton's campaigns and their record around transparency, accountability, good government, digital governance, those kinds of issues. But to do so would be to put at risk our nonprofit status. So I stayed away from that. And in the wake of the election, now that there was a new administration coming in, a new Congress, there was some space to think about what had gone wrong and where there should be some common sense agreement on some of the things that we could fix as a country, as a whole set of democracies. And one of the problems that was very clear is that there was not sufficient transparency around political ads online. There's a expanding world of dark money, which is where you put contributions into a nonprofit, and the donors don't have to be disclosed, and then that those organizations participate in the political process without attribution. Now, there's also political action committees, right, which are this other hugely important, influential part of our politics. Which were, I think, made vastly more, let's say, powerful, right, by successive Supreme Court decisions, which really cemented the idea that money is speech, and therefore people should be able to spend unlimited amounts of money, including outside groups, in our politics. And when you combine that with this new huge digital platforms, principally Google and Facebook, but there are other players in online ads, and I'll come back to that, enabled campaigns to engage in personalized, dark social advertising, where people were being targeted by ads, and to be fair, still are, without it being clear which entity was doing so. Part of that makeup were, of course, some foreign actors, as we've seen repeatedly documented and shared by our Senate here in the United States, but also elsewhere. And while there are vast numbers of problems that require systemic reforms to improve the integrity of our democracy, from gerrymandering to some of these issues around money and politics, the question of whether political advertising should have a disclosure of who paid for it and a disclaimer that the public can see and understand was right in Sunlight's wheelhouse, right? And it's something that Sunlight had been advocating for a long time. It was an issue that I inherited. I was our federal policy manager and then our deputy director. It was super clear that this was something that we had standing on and that we needed to speak out on. And when I was approached by the Washington Post and a couple of different entities to say, what should we do? We came up with what I thought was a creative idea, which is to say that we should do something similar to what the existing platforms of media do with political ads, which is they have a public file. Now, if you have a radio station or a television station and someone pays to put an ad on, you should keep a file and say who paid for this ad, and then there should be that disclaimer on it. And if people watch ads on television, they're familiar. This ad was paid for by X. Now, that's not something we saw in the ads at that point. And what we thought is that should exist. However, there was a big problem.
Let me jump in just to clarify. Yeah. It's not something you saw in online ads. It was required in formats like radio and television. Yep. But there's it's still not a perfect system there, right? Because of the situation you mentioned a moment ago, that it's sort of easy to hide where the money's coming from based on who the donor is and whether it's some huge political action committee.
Yep. And, in theory, the idea behind the Citizens United decision is that super PACs would be transparent, so that the disclosure would of who is behind this advertising would counterbalance the vast scale of unlimited spending by outside groups. Mm-hmm. I don't think that that's happened, but the transparency is not always, I think, enough, right? And this is something that people have to be reminded of. It's not sufficient in of itself. And the key here is that the tech companies were and are less than transparent about this because they didn't have to be. They'd successfully lobbied the Federal Election Commission to treat ads on their platforms kind of like skywriting. And they'd done so intentionally in rulemakings and said, we understand that there's rules and regulations around electioneering, right? That's paid political ads, and that there are political campaigns paying us, but we shouldn't have to do that because we're different. And so there was an internet blind spot. It's something that people at Sunlight were warning about before I got there. And to be fair, Campaign Legal Center and lots of other watchdog groups in DC and elsewhere were saying this is a problem. But it wasn't until 2016 that the scale of the problem and the potential outcomes of it became more clear. And so what this brings it back to is the what to do about it. And what happened is kind of interesting. I commented to BuzzFeed about it. Someone from Mark Warner's office also commented in the same article. And shortly thereafter, I got a call from the Senate saying, hey, we want to figure out some legislation to do something about this. And we'd put up a post, which I'd written up, which is basically my answers to the Washington Post and to these other organizations, saying what should happen is that technology companies should host the public file themselves. And it was quite intentional because I judged correctly that Senate would probably not pass campaign finance reform because Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has flatly refused to pass any kind of campaign finance reform. His position appears to be that disclosure chills speech and there's no problem. Therefore, we're not going to change anything. And I didn't agree with that position. I don't now. I do think that they should pass reforms. And so I worked with Senator Klobuchar's office and Senator Warner's office, and we put together a bill. It was actually pretty fun. We did it over a Google Doc. And over time, came up with legislative language that basically codified this idea that the technology companies themselves should be hosting the ad file. And it shouldn't be tiny ones. It should only be ones that have, I thought, it should be 5 million uniques, per year, but it turned out to be significantly higher than that. So only the internet giants. So there'd be a level playing field, and that would empower the Federal Election Commission to have a rulemaking where they defined how those disclaimers and disclosures should work. Something, by the way, which the FEC has continued to try to do because they have the authority to do that. And the chairwoman has made this an important issue for her, and we'll see, right? And the tech companies are asking for standards. They're I think, even saying they support the Honest Ads Act, even though they know that the political likelihood of it passing is not particularly high, and that they lobbied against it quietly in the last Congress. But they're doing kind of what it says, right? At least different forms of it, right? Twitter just hosts a week's worth of all the ads that a given account puts up, period. Facebook does issue ads and political ads, kind of the both of these around, but it doesn't have an open API, right? You have to apply for it. And as the New York Times just documented, there's a lot of problems with that API that they're not fixing. Google doesn't do issue ads, although its technology for the disclosure is a lot better. And notably, Microsoft, Amazon, Oath, Verizon Media Group now, and Snap, which is perhaps the one really to watch since they have ephemeral ads that go away, don't have any file like that at all. And that's, I think, something that should concern all of us, because there should be a level playing field and there should be disclosure of who is paying to influence our politics. That's really basic, I think, to an informed public. It's really important, too, for the different institutions that we depend upon to find corruption, false advertising, et cetera, for that to be in place. But to date, that hasn't happened. There is some hope. The Honest Ads Act was adopted, and passed in New York State. Mm-hmm. So this is a statute that applies to ads running there, including something which none of these tech companies are disclosing, which is targeting information, which is explicitly spelled out. So when Facebook says that we are complying with the law, look and see if they're disclosing targeting information. And if they're not, then you know that they're not being entirely truthful. And they may have business reasons for that, But of course, this is the central tension with these companies. Are your business purposes more important than the democratic purposes that you exist within? And if there is this tension, that they refuse to resolve on their own, then that is the role of government and regulators to act on. And whether that happens or not, we'll see. I don't think that this kind of regulation, this kind of legislation threatens their business models, which is one reason they've been happy to adopt different forms of transparency in the hopes that doing that would be enough to distract from some of the more problematic aspects of how they make money and the impact that they might be having in society in different ways, which is something you talk about quite a bit here on this program.
Yes. So the crux there is that the Honest Ads Act on the federal level did not pass. And we're left with a growing patchwork of different approaches from the states. And that's what I want to get into when we get back from being highly transparent about who is underwriting this particular show. We'd like to thank our sponsor at this point for this episode of Triangulation, and that is ZipRecruiter. This episode, of course, is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. Hiring used to be hard. You'd have to go to multiple job sites, have stacks of sometimes paper resumes. One way or another, it's always a confusing review process. But today, hiring can be easy, and you only have to go to one place to get it done. That place is ZipRecruiter.com/triangulation. When you go there, you're going to find out that ZipRecruiter sends your job to over 100 of the web's leading job boards, but they don't stop there. With their powerful matching technology, ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes to find people with the right experience and invite them to apply for your job. As applications come in, ZipRecruiter analyzes each one and spotlights the top candidates so you never miss a great match. ZipRecruiter is so effective that 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day. ZipRecruiter just is a way of addressing one of the problems that we've been talking about on the show here today, and that is the fact that it's hard to deal with a vast data pool without a good intermediary to moderate it, and that's what ZipRecruiter does for you. And right now, Triangulation listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at our exclusive web address, ZipRecruiter.com/triangulation. Show your support for this show and ZipRecruiter by going to ZipRecruiter.com/triangulation. That's ZipRecruiter.com/triangulation. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Thank you so much, ZipRecruiter, for your support of the Twit Network and this show, Triangulation. So let's get back to it with Alex Howard. We were discussing the goals and ultimate demise of the Honest Ads Act, which would have required the maintenance of a public file by online sources, the way that terrestrial sources like radio and television have had to do over the years. And of course, all of those rules that apply to those media outlets evolved over time. And the disclosure rules that are going to apply to the online arena are in the process of continuing to evolve, despite the fact that the Honest Ads Act did not pass on a national level. Alex, you just mentioned that it passed virtually verbatim, I'm taking it, in the state of New York. And
there's some small changes, but pretty close.
Yeah. Pretty close. They took your model. Other states are wading into this as well. And we have an interesting piece in our rundown today that hones in on the states of Maryland and Washington, which have enacted such stringent rules about political advertising that they are making this microcosm of their citizens that it will be interesting to study, because the tech companies, the major tech companies, are deciding it is too difficult to comply with the disclosure requirements there for running political ads, so they're just not going to run them to the people in those states. They claim that those hoops are just too much for them to jump through at this point. What do you think of that situation?
I'll say two things. First of all is that the Honest Ads Act has been reintroduced to the 116th Congress. So if you go to congress.gov or govtrack.us, wonderful civil society site, You'll see that HR 2592 has, I think, 31 co-sponsors. In the Senate, it's got a couple co-sponsors. Notably, it's bipartisan with Lindsey Graham supporting it. The legislative realities of the Senate Majority Leader saying no are what they are, but it does exist as something that could be pulled off the shelf. So it's not dead yet, Jim, but it is. It's not necessarily moving, right? And that's worth noting. The second thing is that thanks for sharing that article ahead of time in terms of the briefing. As The Stranger documented, that's a publication out west. And Eli Sanders is a reporter. Facebook has supposedly banned political ads, but they're getting sold still. You can find them on there. So, I'm not convinced that system is stopping electioneering there. Instead, you have a technology company which isn't being effective in terms of enforcing that kind of ban. I think the most blunt way to say this is that these companies, which are making billions of dollars in profit, simply never invested upfront in systems that would have disclosure built in, would have transparency and accountability and good government baked into how their code was built, baked into the business processes, baked into how they identified as an actual entity who was buying the ad. Right. This is a gigantic problem in a world where there are shell companies and LLCs which allow individuals and organizations to obfuscate their identity but still interact with different corporations. And this is why, we have still the perplexing problem of people donating vast amounts of money to various political entities or to events like the inauguration and not being able to figure out who's behind them.
Do you think it's enough? Do you think it's enough for somebody like Facebook to have a policy in place that says we are aware of the possibility that you are a shell company not disclosing who exactly, where exactly your money's come from and who exactly your backers are, but you're required. It's part of our terms of service, part of a condition of doing business with us, that you disclose this to us nonetheless. Is it enough for them to do that?
No, I think self-regulation has clearly not worked. It's clearly not enough. Their efforts to stand up an API clearly haven't been sufficient. Twitter is not doing enough, and like I said, Microsoft, Verizon Media Group, Amazon, and Snap are all likely to be hosting some electioneering. I'd be really shocked if we don't see ephemeral ads on Snap play some kind of role in the next election cycle. But where's their ad file? Where's the watchdogging of them? Look, this idea that the companies are going to do this of their own volition, I don't think is bearing out. It's simply not enough to have the kind of crest of public pressure then result in no federal law passing. Here we are, off to recess without Congress moving on the federal privacy law or these other issues. The companies themselves have extraordinary expertise in terms of their capacity to do different sorts of product development. And the question that's always important for the press to ask is, how many engineers do you have assigned to work on this? Because that shows how much of a priority it is. And I don't think that we've seen political ad disclosure be a priority. I think for many of these companies, it was a rounding error in terms of their total revenues. They simply didn't think it was that important until it became something that was internationally prominent, until they were seeing their chief executives go to Washington and be questioned in front of committees. And then they realized, oh, well, we should do something. But that's after the fact. It wasn't building that into the systems themselves. And I think that's the thing that we need to think about going forward. Where and how should societal values, democratic values, be embedded into these different platforms that are shaping democratic societies? Because if we don't do that, we will see the other visions for how society should be organized embedded, whether it's China's version, which is perhaps the most extant model, or others. And my sense is that if we want to give a better world to our children than the one that I think we're handing down right now. We need to get faster, tougher, and hold the feet of these executives to the fire in terms of whether they have responsibilities that go beyond the bottom line, and whether their products are actually doing something more than just driving more clicks and attention in terms of getting more engagement, but leading us to a better place as an electorate. And that starts with transparency, but it doesn't end there.
So have you seen, aside from New York, that basically with some small tweaks took what you had hoped would have been adopted on a national basis and made it the law in the state of New York? Have you seen any other approaches from other states that you think will be effective?
Well, I'm really curious to see if Washington enforces its laws.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great start. I think that the law in Maryland was opposed by some media groups because they're concerned about the impact upon journalistic entities. But frankly, I don't see why they should be exempt. I do think that the idea of enforcing the kinds of rules on electioneering on journalistic content that Facebook tried to put initially was a very bad idea, right? And that's something I've seen in a bunch of places where marketing journalism is something that they're trying to classify as an ad of political significance. And I think that interpretation is wrong, and I very publicly disagreed with Facebook's VPs about that. But there are laws in the books. The question is whether we're going to see the relevant regulators in the states empowered to go after those issues and try to enforce them, and whether the tech companies will, actually devote resources to improving disclosure or not. And the risk, unfortunately, is that we're going to run into a situation such as exists around data breach laws, which I know that you've thought a lot about. We've got 50 different data breach laws in the country. And when I first came to DC in 2009, it's like, will there be a federal data breach law? Well, 10 years later, there still isn't. And therefore, the worst nightmare of a compliance officer is someone loses a laptop with data from people in all 50 states in the union, plus DC, plus the Commonwealth. And then they have this incredible smorgasbord of legislation to figure out in terms of what their requirements are for notification, what their liabilities are, et cetera. Now, of course, they're being paid to know that, but that is not an ideal situation for a company. There should be a federal standard for data breaches, and there should be a federal standard for online political ads and the disclaimers and disclosures around them, and some broad specifications for how that should actually work. It shouldn't be possible for Facebook to say you only get to access the API and machine readable data if we let you do it. Like that's not how this is supposed to work, right? This is the same kind of fight that existed with TV stations where they said you have to go to and look through our files to get this. And they had to be taken to court by Sunlight, Campaign Legal Center, and others to say, no, this should be online. And now you can go to fcc.gov and there's a public file and you can see the information going online to the public. That's how this should work, right? That there are certain things we should agree should be open by default, and that means online in an open way, and that means structured, that means it doesn't cost anything, and that means you're free to use and reuse it without restriction. And that's how it should be at the end state. It's not the way it is right now.
And if it is that way, if Washington and New York and other states that have enacted laws trying to address this problem begin to enforce their laws, and they begin to get access to that information, I'm assuming that the logic here is, no matter how many engineers the tech companies have allocated, when you make that information public, you can start to poke at the problem of money being hidden by entities and getting to the bottom of who an entity actually is. Is
that way? Watchdogs, researchers, technologists, the regulators can all work together and understand what's happening and inform the public of it. And there are lots of people who feel like money in politics should be more restricted, that there should be public financing of elections, that there should be quiet periods, that there should be any number of different approaches to campaigns and politics that exist in other democracies around the world. But the basic start here, the ground level, has to be understanding who's paying for the ads and having a copy of them, so that if there is domestic or foreign interference, that we understand it. And if there's false and duplicitous advertising that's ephemeral, that disappears, that's targeted, that you can't see in the public timeline, that seeks to, for instance, discriminate against people based upon various protected classes and try to damp their voting pattern or outright mislead them, right? Which is behavior we saw in the last presidential election cycle, and we should expect to see again. Then there can be some accountability back to the entities that paid for it, and relevant referrals to law enforcement. Because we shouldn't live in a world where you can send someone targeted messaging that's misleading, that's outright lies, or that has a, negative impact upon their participation in democracy. That is, I think, an illiberal idea, and it's not one that belongs in our country, even though there are obviously forces that wish to have it be so.
You brought up Snap a couple times and the fact that its ads are ephemeral. Wouldn't that apply to Facebook and Instagram as well? Of course, two sides of the same ownership coin there in their stories aspect that came about to compete with Snap. That those things will go away as well. So it's got that problem as well. Is Snap small enough? You also brought up that there had to be a threshold of companies that were going to be subject to the act and smaller ones that were not, because it was, I suppose, too much to ask for them to comply. Would Snap have been subject to the Honest Ads Act if it had passed on a federal level?
I'm pretty sure, yeah. I mean, they've got 310, according to what I last saw, 310 monthly active users. Absolutely. I mean, they're easily in that space. They should have a public ad file. I also looking at how Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio, AOC, right? I always get that one wrong.
Ocasio-Cortez.
Yes, Ocasio-Cortez. Thank you. She I think has used stories in an important way. Like she's connecting with constituents, connecting with supporters in a natural, intimate way that we should expect to see become the norm. Right now, she's an uncommon politician, an uncommon person, and uncommonly open in that ability to do that. But it's also, again, the edge, right? Now, she doesn't save her stories. I wrote a paid medium piece back at the beginning of the year, suggesting that in the same way that technology companies should be hosting political ad files, maybe they should be hosting verified politicians' stories and live streams by default in a river, so that there is a file of those interactions. Now, the Congresswoman says these are personal and doesn't archive them. And she doesn't have to. There isn't a requirement under a Federal Records Act, much less the Presidential Records Act that exists for the White House, that says you got to retain these things. But you know who else is using Instagram stories? Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil. Now, there are groups that are making an effort to archive that. But we can and should expect different governments with different kinds of leaders who will use these platforms in ways that I think might not be entirely democratic. And there, I think, is a responsibility if you're going to host their speech and verify them and market, that is a place where you want the public to come and interact with them. Then you have a responsibility to think about archiving it for posterity. If the government does that itself, there may be different rules and regulations that require it. But I think the technology companies have been irresponsible in not thinking about this from the outset. If we're going to host these streams, these stories, this advertising and electioneering, then we should think about what the conditions for that hosting should be. And in return for us giving you this platform and encouraging people to follow you, effectively giving you something, right, and for free, and there's some trade-off in terms of data and them selling ads against it, et cetera. But if we're going to do that, then we have some obligation to the societies we exist within to host that, so that there's some accountability that goes with the transparency down the line. And it doesn't take a lot of creativity to see how the use of Facebook in Myanmar, that they themselves admitted resulted in some fairly negative outcomes for the Rohingya people,
right,
could be something that exists elsewhere. And every single one of these CEOs and their boards and their investors should be mindful of that. And again, these companies are highly profitable. These are not shoestring nonprofits. These are not newspapers that are loaded down by a lot of debt and a collapsing business model that's been eroded by the fragmentation of their audiences and the unbundling of the advertising that sustain them, the dissolution of their local monopolies. These are fabulously wealthy companies. And I think it's very clear that they should be making decisions which improve the societies that they operate within, and instead of frankly enabling the kind of divisive engagement that increases polarization or even radicalization, which is something that unfortunately there is credible evidence of on YouTube and elsewhere.
It seems to me too, though, that I guess maybe this is from my background as a lawyer, and we are subject to a whole host of ethical rules that ride over what we do in our practices. It seems to me like politicians should be, at a minimum, subjected to those same kinds of rules, and that it should be on them to keep an archive of the way they're interacting with the public as well. And that to say, when you're a public official and you're speaking with constituents, whether you're the president of the United States or a congressperson or a senator or a mayor, to say that those are personal interactions is sort of too cute by half, don't you think?
Well, I think we have to figure out where different things sit. I don't want to live in a world where every single interaction I have in a digital medium is recorded. I don't think that there's an expectation that everything someone writes, everything that they chat, everything that they say, it should be archived by default. I think there should be carve-outs for officials and politicians to have clearly personal interactions with their children, with their family, to have discussions with their lawyer, to have some privileges in terms of their privacy. Just because you enter into service doesn't mean that you cede all of that. However, you do have some expectations, and that's why we have, through the Office of Government Ethics at the federal level, disclosures of people's financial, records, and an agreement, an ethics agreement in terms of how they'll comport themselves in public service to avoid any conflicts of interest that are revealed in that. And sometimes the way that works is you have to divest from various assets, from various companies, et cetera, so that those conflicts won't be exited in office. Of course, we have the worst violation of that in United States history right now, with a president who's refused to disclose his tax returns, not required by law, and has refused to divest from his businesses because the president is not covered by the relevant federal ethics statute. But there is an expectation for everybody else under him to do exactly that. And I think it's reasonable, because the public should have no doubt that there is any other interest being served than the public's interest by a given public servant, by a given civil servant. And that's why these laws exist. It's because for many centuries, maybe even for millennia, there can and has been misuse of public power for private gain, which is how Transparency International defines corruption. Now, when it comes to speech, we've seen some very, very prominent discussions about what is personal and what is private, perhaps most famously with respect to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's use of email. Now, she did it in the wrong direction, right? she should have been on a government server. And then if there was personal communication on there, then there would be a relevant exemption that could be claimed before it was disclosed to the public. What happened with her, though, is something that, frankly, is a problem at every level of government and across all the rest of the parties. And all you have to do is survey the news headlines to see that the use of personal email, personal devices and mobile phones, and now encrypted and ephemeral apps is something that's a problem in multiple states, multiple different kinds of governors. And of course, what we talked about earlier with Governor of Puerto Rico, something that happened on Telegram. And clearly their openness in that chat suggests they did not expect that to ever come into public view. And the question, I think, for me is always, is something happening there which is public business? Right? Is there something which is relevant to a contract, relevant to something that someone's in charge of in some way? And then if that's the case, is there an expectation it should be put into the public record? And the reality is that our lives are going to continue to be leaky. You know, when I first came to Washington, people had a BlackBerry and then they had a different smartphone. Increasingly now you see people might have them merged into one, but in many cases, particularly in the national security world, people still have two devices to try to actually keep these things separate. And many people who work in the corporate world have a corporate email and a personal email, and they try to keep those things separate. And there are legal reasons for that if they're in a highly regulated industry, and there are ethical reasons for that too. In the public sector, though, particularly, I think that we should have an expectation that if somebody is using a given platform to conduct business, then they will make an effort to memorialize those communications. And if a given platform doesn't allow that archiving, for instance, it's designed to have an encrypted chat go away, like Confide, then you shouldn't be using it for public business at all, because that creates the appearance of intentional secrecy to evade sunlight, right? And that is, of course, exactly what happened with the White House staff and during, before they entered office and then transition, and then directly afterwards. And then they had to be reminded by, federal government lawyers that you can't use these devices, you can't use these services in the White House because there's a very significant statute there, the Presidential Records Act, which is more aggressive than anything else in the books in the country, that everything has to be retained. Of course, there's, a big problem when you have a president who himself tears up documents and doesn't adhere to the law himself, but that is a separate issue.
I keep going around in my head with the issue of whether what we've been talking about here as far as who is behind, what's the money behind the ads that we're seeing on social platforms, and how elected public officials, who we know who they are, how they're using social media platforms. Is this just a subset of the greater content moderation at scale problem, or is it something else?
I think it's something else, because I think the content moderation at scale problem is a wicked one and has a lot of implications that have to do not just with speech and business models, but in terms of the expectations we have for it, right? And that once we're, I think, implicating paid political advertising, electioneering, that is a clear category that there are existing regulations and expectations for disclosures and disclaimers about. The so-called organic content that goes up is a much harder one, which is why, say, paid trolling is so much more of a difficult issue. This is why somebody who's just putting out outright lies, slow fakes, dumb fakes, eventually deep fakes, where they're using software to create the impression that somebody is doing something that they never said or did. Those I think are going to be much more difficult for platforms to effectively moderate, even though to some extent I think we can and will see different approaches to it, particularly if different countries pass laws that create liability around them. We have created a legal structure here, which much better than me, that it lets the platforms be basically exempt as intermediates from liability for speech that is on them. Now, that's something that the individual user might not be exempt from, but the platform it is. And that's what has allowed the internet to blossom and grow and create these huge platforms that we see right now. Unfortunately, there's some pretty toxic legislation that's being debated here in DC, which I think is fairly described as a fairness doctrine for the internet, that would be hugely problematic and create more aggressive, onerous, and toxic government-mandated regulation that would be far worse than we've seen in any other previous platform or media.
There's a really good piece in the Washington Post today on the content moderation problem. That it touches on what you just raised, the fact that in the United States we have this safe harbor, limited safe harbor, restricted safe harbor. Certain things certainly don't fall within it, but for the things that do, the platforms are not responsible for the unlawful acts of their users. The article is a deep dive on how Facebook and others are tackling the content moderation problem and outsourcing a lot of that activity to places like the Philippines and others. But there's a pretty detailed examination of what's going on in the Philippines, in Manila in particular, and the really detrimental effects that it's having on the people that are employed to, they describe themselves as like 9/11 first responders, that they're just on the front lines of the horror, the terrible, deplorable things that the platforms are being used for, and being asked to flag and put these things down. And just the psychological toll of that is enormous. And but the other thing, sort of tangentially, that the article points out is the fact that, oh, by the way, it's not just the U.S. is perhaps an exception with this safe harbor strategy that we have. There are countries where these companies do business where they are on the hook for the unlawful acts of their users, and they have to take a different approach in those countries and approach what they're going to pull down much more aggressively, and that it hasn't stopped them from doing business there. I'm sure it has a vastly different impact on speech and the overbreadth of what gets pulled down. But I thought it was an interesting point to make in that context. And the takeaway that I got from this article, and it's not the first, there's been a lot of sunlight being shown on this issue in recent weeks. But I came away with a couple of impressions. One of them is from one of the people profiled in that article, who says, people shouldn't be doing this. It's too bad. This is a perfect instance for machine learning to be those 9/11 first responders on the front lines of human horror. And they will not suffer the psychological damage that we do. Of course, there are, machine learning and AI are not perfect tools yet for this task, and that's why humans are being deployed. And the other thing I kind of came away with is God, given the scope of this and the difficulty of it, again, it's a very hard issue. But if I were Facebook, I might just be washing my hands of allowing things to be uploaded and then reviewed after the fact. I don't know how you screen on the front end, but it seems like that these people are trying to accomplish that in some sense, but maybe you just have to be a whole lot more aggressive with who your users are. And I know that that's not popular because these platforms have become so important to public communication and speech and all the rest. But, if it's my company, that's a lesser priority than I don't want the horror there. What do you think about that, Alex?
Well, it's certainly difficult. I think we're very rapidly entering an age where the global internet that's the same everywhere is splintered, right? We're going to see the development of a lot of different internets that have different rules. They may all use the IP protocol, but they'll be different levels of security. There'll be different levels of privacy. There'll be different constraints around identity. There'll be different expectations in terms of consequence if you try to upload content that has certain categories of life, right? There are things which are pretty clearly not, I think, from a human's rights perspective, something that should be given broad dissemination. Murders, rapes, snuff films, child pornography, those they're clear, and then there's a whole lot in between. Up into including things that in this country we accept as something that's protected from government regulation around freedom of expression, et cetera, like burning the flag, for instance, something that Supreme Court's been pretty clear on. And the outcome is going to be a very heterogeneous, very Wild West, in the liminal spaces and highly constrained in the public broad spaces environment. It may be something where our devices themselves will have to be smart enough to tell us you're in a different country now. Here are the new, concerns and constraints for what you share. And the consequences for it. I just read a story in the Times about a protester in Hong Kong who's followed by a plainclothes perspective, and setting up a Telegram channel was enough for that person to apprehend him. That one of the challenges if we don't see, say, end-to-end encryption be something that's adopted across the population is that the people who are using it may be targets for police intelligence services or people in corporations who are trying to stop leaks of proprietary information because they are attempting to obfuscate their communications, even if they might have legitimate reasons for it, as opposed to attempting to hide activity, which is illegal. And my gut feeling is that the model that has been pursued to date of growth at all costs, scale at all costs, before profit, before a model is the one that has led us into this, as opposed to the careful building of community with norms, with expectations, with a stronger effort to prevent people from doing things which are really far behind the pale, and then the grayer space where there's more give. And the companies themselves are just going to have to decide, what kind of product and space they want to be known for. The question is then how they go about it. If they have, I think, as much money, certainly if we take Facebook, then it's pretty reasonable to ask how they're spending it. And there's been a lot of good reporting. Casey Newton, I think, had a great piece about how little moderators are paid and the impact of that moderation upon them, including radicalization, including and believing conspiracy theories, but certainly in outcomes that closely resemble PTSD. Yeah. And if they're going to have this flood of the worst of humanity reflected on these screens, then there should be, I think, a reasonable investment in these staff and a reasonable acknowledgement that it has an impact upon their mental health, and some kind of tours of duty and rotations, et cetera, so that the people involved aren't left traumatized by the experience. And to your point, I think that there is going to be a stronger case for review before upload, review before something goes live. That's something that Facebook has already had to think about with its live product. Yeah. I think it's fair to say they don't want any more mass murders to be live streamed on its platform. They don't want shooters to act like they're in a reality video game where they're killing people. And the only way for them to actually affect that is to put in new code in the code, right? Not like legal code that's actually enacted, to create more friction, and to have somebody sign off on it. Now that obviously is a huge change to a given platform. It's a huge change to the idea where the gatekeepers have been removed. This is all of a sudden saying, wait, we're going to put in this other gatekeeper now, but what's the other choice? And my thinking here is that we're going to see a whole bunch of different business models. We're going to see a whole lot of different laws. We're going to see a lot of different countries and states take different approaches to this. And there's going to be a lot of messiness. And we'll see how different approaches work or they don't. Right. One thing we know in history is that if you create ministries of truth where government regulators are put in charge of making censorship decisions, it generally does not result in terrific outcomes for a given population. And if we set up huge corporations, which are not very accountable, there could be some problems there too. And this is something you see Facebook struggling with in terms of it's trying to create this judicial body and this new governance structure to create these, new structures for review and for, reconciliation, arbitration, right? And the problem, in my view, is that they've been very aggressive in moderating content which violates copyright, and way too lenient in not moderating content which is violent or abusive or goes further, and if into something that's frankly darker, which exists, right? I've been online and social media for a long time, and I've seen all of that, and
right.
I don't. But
as you say, there are liminal spaces where you might be in danger of encountering material like that, and I think your average Facebook and Instagram user probably don't think of those platforms as those places, and yet they are. And the other takeaway I had was that these outsource the countries where these duties are being outsourced may well have an objection to that kind of strategy. The way they've been having, other countries, maybe there's some overlap, have objected to what's been done with the global recycling crisis, the not clean trash that they've been responsible for is no longer something that they want to deal with and are shipping it back. It sort of seems like a similar parallel, because these jobs, again, from this Washington Post article, are being advertised with things like, as you said, the people are not paid what we would consider a reasonable wage for the duties that they are performing. But in their country, it's a good wage. That's right. So the jobs are attractive, and they're being advertised with things like data management, as opposed to, have you seen the movie Clockwork Orange, where they pin the guy's eyes open and they make him watch every horror of humanity? That's what you'll be doing. And there's just no disclosure of that whatsoever. And I don't see that sitting well for very long. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what's happening with electronic waste, as an example too, right? Yeah. There's a market demand to recover the rare earths and copper and other things from from that trash. And as long as that exists, if you eventually go down far enough, there will be people for whom that's a significant amount of money and therefore will trade their health for it. And so this goes to sort of our, I think, broader responsibilities as a society, which in theory are reflected in the values that our government enacts around human rights and labor laws and environmental standards, which is why things like trade agreements really matter. And whether you put human rights on the table or not when you're negotiating with China, and call them out for running camps full of Uyghurs, right? Whether you interacting with countries where you're outsourcing manufacturing to mandate labor laws that actually are meaningful or not. and whether there's any kind of global compact around what those labor laws should be when you're doing this kind of work. And it's, I think, an emergent enough thing that we're still early on, but it's definitely something that, as long as we, I think, decide that there should be some kind of filter, and that the computer, the technologies that exist around us using, as you say, machine learning, some varieties of AI, aren't sufficient, then if those humans are involved, then just as in any other kind of employment, there should be some recognition that their working conditions could be hazardous or not. And that's, I think, going to be a point of contention throughout the rest of our lives. And we can and will see digital sweatshops evolve. And then the question will be whether there are safe havens in different governments. And I think it's fair to expect that there will be in collapsed or failed states, right?
Yeah.
And there'll be offshoring of all kinds of things. This is something we will see, right? We are living in the future right now in terms of science fiction, and part of that has always been the idea of seasteading or different entities that are outside of nation state laws and sort of make their own state, and they often have a libertarian bent, which means, in theory, that you see sort of an absolute untrammeled market forces affecting things without any kinds of those conditions. And the one of the bigger questions will be whether these things actually matter enough for consumers to have them make different decisions in a way that creates a force on either regulators and government or upon the entities themselves in a way that causes them to change their behavior or to enact laws that mandate that they do with sufficient enforcement to do something about it. Something that could be quite challenged in extrajudicial zones.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is the second time, I just would note, for people who are thinking of concocting an unofficial triangulation drinking game, it's the second time I've hosted that seasteading has come up. So make of that what you will.
Sure.
Last topic before we close out the show. The FTC fined Facebook $5 billion in the wake of Cambridge Analytica and the company's violation of its previous obligations to the FTC and discipline from the FTC. Thoughts?
Seems like a pretty sweet deal for Facebook. Mm-hmm. They don't have any liability for what's happened before. Looks like all the executives who are involved don't have an issue. They made how much last quarter? 16 billion-ish. Mm-hmm. They have a consent decree to live under. There's a lot of conditions that exist within it. But it more than anything to me at a high level shows that the FTC is just inherently limited in terms of the tools it has under existing law. Something that again better than I, that because we don't have a strong federal data protection law, we don't have GDPR, we don't have a consumer privacy law. There's no proportionate fine that would say for every single user whose data was inappropriately leaked and you guys knew about it and then used by Cambridge Analytica or some other entity, then there's this degree of fine associated with it. And there's personal liability for the executive. I think they simply didn't have the legal tools, and this is the outcome of that. I think that the fact that the markets reacted the way that they did show that this, people feel like this doesn't have any impact upon Facebook's fundamental business model, right? And this is, I think, in the more this is a tough term, but the kind of their surveillance capitalism, right, is something that is not hindered by this. There's a whole bunch of different things they have to check off in terms of taking a step ahead of time, but I don't think it fundamentally changes that, and it won't. And the FTC, I don't think can, unless and until it's given different tools by Congress. And one of the stories of the last decade in Washington is that lobbying by the technology companies has been very successful in averting any high-level consumer privacy law. And I see that that people in the chat are talking about it's $5 billion, and it's true. That's a lot of money. It's a record.
Mm-hmm.
But in the context of their profits, it's not. It's
right.
not.
Right. And I don't think the FTC thought that it was a lot in the context of their profits. We have there's a New York Times piece discussing the give and take among the commissioners from the various political parties at the FTC who were in charge of deciding that this happened. And they concluded, the three Republican commissioners all concluded very pragmatically precisely what you just said. And they didn't use the terms that you did. We don't have the right legal tools. Pardon me. But I think that's what they meant. They asked, is the relief we would obtain through this settlement equal to or better than what we could reasonably obtain through litigation? If the answer had been no, it would have made sense to aggressively move forward in court. The answer, however, was yes. So, they were working with the tools they had and deemed that this was the best solution.
Yep.
So,
it would be a backbreaking fine for a lot of companies. For these companies, it's significant, but again, the reaction of investors suggests it's not enough to concern them. The role of a fine is usually to create some kind of disincentive for bad behavior. And the scale of the fine is often proportionate to that disincentive. It's like transparency, it should be proportionate to power. The reason we want presidents to disclose their tax returns when you do not expect private citizens to do so is because they have so much power. There are expectations once you enter positions of great responsibility that you will be more forthcoming so people can understand the decisions you make. They can understand the governance. They can understand the constraints. They can understand what's happening or not. And part of this consent decree is more disclosure. But the evidence I've seen suggests that consumers still, with all the disclosures that exist, still don't understand what they're giving away. And in many cases, they also have fatigue and a sense of hopelessness. Like my data, how can I control this? Particularly when you talk about passive consumption, you talk about data brokers, you talk about telecom companies and phones collecting location data through apps without you thinking about it, or collecting all the different points of data about your life and then being pulled into a political file that's used to target ads, in a hyper personalized way. These aren't things that people feel for good reason they have a great deal of control over. And the idea with the data protection regulation that was put in over in Europe is to give people more control, to say, no, I don't want you to do that. You can't use it for these purposes. You can't use it at all, or I don't want you to collect that. And then the question is, should you be able to say that and still use the given service or not? And I think that's one we're really going to have to come to grips with. If we decide that these platforms are important enough, if we decide that they are like utilities, if there's, say, a monopoly where I don't have a great deal of choices for an ISP, or I really want to use the best search engine, or there's a whole lot of network lock-in for a gigantic social network, then is a given government going to say that here are the constraints for how and where the data can be collected or be used in order for someone to do that? And we're not there yet here. I think Europe has moved in that direction, but there's a reason that Facebook wasn't founded there to begin with, right? Because they already had laws that would have put a constraint upon, say, you taking a picture of someone and uploading it without their permission. Yeah. And there are some advantages to that in a digital world where infinite replication and scale means it's very hard for something to be forgotten once it goes out. And my sense is that we're all going to be grappling with this. And as we see more and more the kinds of harms that exist from your data exhaust and data shadow that follows you, we'll see more reactions that create different amounts of friction. New York State just constrained the disclosure of mugshots. It turns out there's a cottage industry around websites that basically blackmail people to get their picture removed because they don't want their picture from when they got arrested to be the first thing that shows up when someone searches for them. Now, I think that's actually not unreasonable, but I also think it's problematic to exempt it entirely from disclosure from media corporations, and to think about in turn for those media corporations to think, well, should we be creating the data shadow that hangs over someone's life or not? That's something which I think should be discussion in communities all the way down to the county and precinct level, all the way up to the federal level. Where should we be putting in friction for different kinds of data collection and for different kinds of use or reuse? And the problem I see is vast amounts of data collection already exist, and much more is coming through the Internet of Things, right? Where different sensors are going to be collecting not just what you're reading, not just what you're searching for, not just what you're watching, not just what you're sharing, but where you are and when you were there.
Yeah.
And that is the kind of powerful data that we need to be really cautious about, because if that ends up being combined with an authoritarian state, that is a police state of a degree and tenor that's out of the worst dystopias, and we're really close to it. China has already gone a long way in that direction. And facial recognition by default combined with these things is going to create invisible barbed wire. And if we in more democratic states that value human rights don't start putting those values into the technologies and how they're governed now, I think we're going to be regretting it even more than we do at this moment.
Yeah. We started our conversation discussing data literacy and science fiction, and I think we've circled right back to it.
Well, an informed public's pretty important in democracies, and I appreciate all that you do to, make people smarter, more informed, more enlightened, more connected to the things you're thinking about, and that you do it across platforms. I've been learning from you for a long time.
Oh, thank you so much. And I can't express my appreciation enough for all of the work that you've done throughout your career and continue to do. Folks can find out much more about that and about Alex himself at digifile. Is it .com? I believe it is.
.info.
.info, yes. Okay, digifile.info. And also, you're speaking of people pushing the envelope of how others might be using technologies. Everyone and their dog has a newsletter these days. I have a newsletter. Most of them go out by email. Yours, though, just to be distinctive and cutting edge, goes out by text. How can people connect with you there?
So I've been experimenting with a text newsletter. It's called Project Text. It's in my Twitter bio. If you want to check it out, I think I can quickly pull up the URL. I don't know it off the top of my head. But it's basically an experiment. There's a bunch of local media companies are using it, where people basically subscribe, and then you get a text. Mine is at projecttext.com/campaigns/23. And it's super easy. You sign up for it, and then I send you a text message. It's usually right now it's like a couple a week. Sometimes it's a little more often. Sometimes there's been bigger breaks. But it's a like directly in your inbox letter from me.
And then directly back to yours too, right? People can text you back.
That's right. You can,
cool.
So it's one-to-one, and I am, for the moment, it's at a scale where I can actually respond to people as we go.
Good. So sign up while it's still at that scale, and you can interact with Alex. You can also check out E Pluribus Unum, which is a group blog, correct?
No, it's just me.
It's just you.
I've had different entities try to get guest posts and put stuff on there, but that's just me. I've been maintaining it since 2013. It was a experiment when I first started it to see what could happen, and lo and behold, I got credentialed by the White House, cited by the Speaker of the House, NPR. It became a media entity. I put it down when I was at Sunlight Foundation for a couple years, and then when I left, I started it up again. It's decidedly more analyst-y, advocate-y these days than it's journalistic in terms of the work. I don't do as much reporting there as I do analysis. But that's, I think, just a reflection of how my work and my role and my job has evolved in the last decade.
That's very cool. Keep up the great work there as well. And thank you so much for taking all this time to sit down with me here today on Triangulation. I've really enjoyed our discussion.
I enjoyed it too. Thank you so much for the invitation. Please keep doing what you're doing. It was awesome to come join you and to join all the audience too.
All right. Folks, with that, we will go ahead and wrap up this episode of Triangulation. We record this show on Fridays at 11 o'clock Pacific time. That's when it's live, and you can join us. But other than that, you can find it at twit.tv/triangulation. You can subscribe to the show there. You can find out all the different ways you can enjoy the show, given the timing and device of your choice. So we're just grateful that you join us however you join us. And thank you so much for tuning in however you've done so today. We'll see you next time on Triangulation. Till then, take care.